All right, just a week to go before the midterm elections, elections which could change the balance of power in Washington. Republicans have their eyes on control of the House and possibly the Senate. But no matter who's in charge, the big challenge will be the same: how to revive the U.S. economy. Joining us now with his suggestions for the next Congress, Ed Lazear, former chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President George W. Bush. He's now a professor at Stanford Business School. Ed, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure to be with you.
You know, we'll just cut to the chase here. I mean, your focus is for boosting the economy and cutting the deficit on cutting spending rather than raising taxes. Now, I can understand why you say raising taxes would hurt economic growth, but wouldn't cutting spending also hurt economic growth?
I don't think so, and I'll tell you why. If you look at the pattern that we're in right now, we have the highest ratio of government spending to GDP that we've had since World War II. Over the past couple of decades, the ratio of spend to GDP has been below 20%. Now we're at 25%. That's all happened in the past couple of years. So that's an enormous increase, an enormous change in the whole structure of the U.S. government and its importance to the U.S. economy. The problem has been that I don't think we've gotten any bang for the buck. So if you look at the numbers, if you look at what's happened to GDP growth, certainly if you look at what's happened to the labor market, we haven't gotten a lot of action out of the increase in spending. And my view is that most of the increase in spending has not been for stimulus purpose. It's really been an intentional expansion in the government. So the question then becomes, when you cut back on that, what does that do to the economy? I think the effect will be symmetric. That is, that the whatever we lose will be no larger than what we gained, and I don't think we gained a whole lot. So I think that's the direction to go.
Ed, let me ask you about the realistic chances of either party actually cutting spending and reducing government, because I know you've got these statistics that under George W. Bush, we only spent about 16–17% of GDP. But, you know, you had the No Child Left Behind Act. You had the Medicare spending boosting spending to entitlements, starting 2 wars. I mean, you guys weren't exactly spendthrifts yourself.
Well, it is true. I mean, there were some expenditures that increased. Obviously, the expenses on defense went up, and went up significantly. The same thing was true, by the way, under President Reagan. The other thing that you can point to was the increase in Medicare spending. Those would be the obvious ones. But despite that, even with those, the numbers under President Bush were still about almost exactly the same as the numbers under President Clinton. So, you know, to sort of stay out of the realm of politics, let's just talk about the past 2 decades and simply say that over the past 2 decades we had one pattern that prevailed, and that was keeping spending about at 20% of GDP, something like that. Now we're in a different world, and I don't think it's a very helpful world. As you know, there have been a number of studies that have looked at the effect of taxes on economic growth. There have been a number of studies that have looked at the size of the debt on economic growth. All of those studies, virtually all of them, suggest that either high deficits, high debt to GDP ratios, or high taxes have negative effects on economic growth. So we've got to get away from that. Yeah, go ahead, Carol. I'm sorry.
No, don't be. But, you know, I want to push what Matt is talking about, because we hear a lot of people come on and say, yep, you got to cut spending, you got to cut spending. Nobody, though, seems to have the nerve or the strength, the political will to actually start making the cuts. You know, whether it's Republicans or Democrats alike, I don't think we should make it a political fight, because everybody's been responsible for the growth in government at this point. I mean, when do we actually see a politician say, we got to redo this government, we got to stop making cuts, because it can't keep going on this trajectory?
Well, you're right, but we have seen some calls, even from Congress, even from the current Congress, to try to put limits on spending. I just got a letter after I had my piece in the Wall Street Journal about growing our way out of the deficit. I got a letter from Congressman Mike Pence, who said that they're proposing a constitutional amendment to put limits on spending. Now, you know, those are pretty tough, and we know constitutional amendments are not easy to pass.
Right.
But the Congress has in the past been able to pass legislation that has limited spending. I mean, Graham-Rudman is an example of that. It might not have been especially effective, but I think the kind of thing that...
Ed, do you think the Congress we have in place right now can do something like that?
Well, I think that the Congress that we have in place, and particularly the Congress that we're likely to get after next week's election, will be very sensitive to this issue. It's clear that the American people are not happy with the spending pattern that we've seen over the past couple of years. That's become the main theme of this election, and the fact that that's so.
Well, they're more unhappy about not having jobs at this point and the economy not being so great. I think that's the bigger issue.
I got to chime in there as well, Ed. I mean, I appreciate what you're saying. If you grow the economy, that's great in the long run. For the deficit, fantastic, and for jobs, fantastic. But we're on a political cycle here, right? So every 2 years, you got to worry about those jobs numbers. If you cut spending, what happens to 9.5, 9.6 unemployment?
Well, but I guess I would disagree with you, Carol. I think that is the point. I think the American people do see what's going on. They do see that there has been increased spending, and despite the increased spending, there hasn't been any significant effect on unemployment. You know, if you look at the numbers today, right now, the typical worker, the unemployed worker, is 1/3 as likely to find a job as he was back in 2007. So that's a real hardship. Everybody sees that. Everybody understands that. And the point is, that's despite the fact that we've had this massive increase in spending and these massive stimulus programs, cash for clunkers, first-time home buyers, you name it. There have been a lot of government programs, most of which have done very little, I think, to affect the labor market, and that's really the key to the American people.
I got to put you on the spot here because I'll get viewer emails that say, so what does Ed suggest we cut?
Okay. Well, what I would suggest we do, again, you know, I had this proposal to limit the size of growth, and I personally would not be specific about that in the sense that I would not tell Congress what to do. I think that there's no way they're going to be able to accomplish that without looking at entitlements. We have a health care bill that is going to increase expenditures by $1 trillion. We're going to have to re-examine that. We're going to have to examine Medicare. Social Security is something that we're going to have to look at as well, although Social Security is something that's more easily dealt with. The entitlement side is where all the action is. The discretionary spending, as you know, is only about 16% of the total budget, and so no matter how well we do on the discretionary spending side, we're not going to get there unless we look at entitlements. So I would say that's got to be the first place to target.
And this seems silly to say, but we only have 20 seconds left, and can you please explain what you mean that Social Security is easily dealt with?
Well, it's easily dealt with in the sense that if we do some fixing of the formula, the indexation formula, we can get 90% of the way to solving the Social Security problem, at least in terms of the budgetary issues. So there are things that we can do on the Social Security side. Medicare is a much more significant problem because we need to get health care costs under control before we can deal with Medicare.
Doesn't sound easy, but sounds like we got to do it. All right, Ed, thank you so much. Ed Lazear of Stanford University Business School.
Thank you very much.